It was a quiet winter morning in Istanbul, 1929. Inside the ancient walls of the Topkapı Palace, where the Ottoman sultans once ruled half the world, dust hung like a thin veil in the air. The palace had long since become more of a museum than a seat of power, its rooms filled with relics, manuscripts, and forgotten treasures. That morning, a group of historians, led by Halil Ethem Eldem, director of the National Museums of Turkey, entered one of the lesser-used storage chambers. Their goal was simple: to catalog leftover parchments, scrolls, and naval charts from the Ottoman archives before many decayed beyond saving. One of the assistants, a German-Turkish scholar named Gustav Adolf Deissmann, bent over a stack of rolled manuscripts tied in silk ribbons. The edges were brittle, browned by 4 centuries of heat and humidity. He gently unrolled one and froze. It was unlike anything they'd seen. The parchment, drawn on gazelle skin, was vividly colored. A map dated 1513, signed by an Ottoman admiral named Piri ibn Haji Mehmed Reis. Across its surface were familiar coastlines: the western shores of Africa, the coast of South America, and at the bottom, something impossible. A vast, curving landmass stretched across the southern edge, a continent that looked exactly like Antarctica. But the map was drawn 3 centuries before anyone had ever seen Antarctica. Deissmann called out for Eldem. Within minutes, the small group of scholars crowded around the map, whispering in disbelief. The handwriting was clear. The annotations described strange lands beyond the Atlantic and even referred to animals: llamas, parrots, and monstrous serpents. Yet the most astonishing part was that the coastline of the mysterious southern continent, drawn with uncanny precision, matched Antarctica's true outline beneath the ice, something no one could even measure accurately until the 20th century. For hours, they stood in stunned silence. "Could this be a hoax?" one whispered. Eldem shook his head slowly. "It's written in early Ottoman script. The materials are authentic. This is no forgery." They called for experts from the University of Istanbul. Word spread quietly among scholars. A lost Ottoman map might show a world no one should have known existed. And when an American naval attaché later got word of it, the U.S. government itself became curious. Within months, copies of the map were sent to the U.S. Library of Congress, and from there, to the U.S. Hydrographic Office. In 1956, a letter from the U.S. Air Force Cartographic Section to Turkish authorities confirmed what the Ottoman scholars had suspected. The coastline of the southern land on the map matched modern seismic data of Antarctica under the ice. The Air Force admitted something no scientist wanted to say aloud. The geographical detail shown in the lower part of the map agrees remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. This indicates that the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. That letter, still preserved in archives, sent shockwaves through the scientific world. How could a Turkish admiral in 1513 have drawn a map showing Antarctica without ice, when modern humans only discovered the continent in 1820 and didn't know what lay beneath its ice until the 1950s? Was it a coincidence? An ancient legend? Or evidence that Piri Reis had access to maps far older than any civilization known to history? In that silent palace room in 1929, none of the men could have known that what they had unrolled was one of the greatest historical enigmas of the modern age, a fragment of parchment that defied everything we knew about exploration, science, and human memory. And it all began, as great mysteries often do, with a forgotten drawer in a forgotten room. He was born Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, sometime between 1465 and 1470, in Gallipoli, a coastal city on the Dardanelles Strait, where the waters of the Aegean Sea met the Marmara Sea. The Ottoman Empire was then expanding at lightning speed. Constantinople had fallen just a decade earlier, and Sultan Mehmed II's navy ruled the Mediterranean like a steel tide. Gallipoli was a shipyard town, filled with the smell of tar, the clang of hammers, and the songs of sailors from dozens of nations. As a child, Piri grew up listening to tales of strange islands, sunken cities, and the edge of the world. He would watch the sailors return from campaigns in Italy, the Aegean, and Egypt, their ships heavy with plunder and with stories. By the time he was a teenager, he had already joined the fleet of his famous uncle, the legendary corsair and admiral Kemal Reis, a man who would shape Piri's destiny forever. A life at sea. Under Kemal Reis, Piri learned more than navigation. He learned how to survive the chaos of a world where maps could mean life or death. The Mediterranean of the late 14th century was not just a sea. It was a chessboard of empires: Spain, Portugal, Venice, Genoa, the Mamluks, and the Ottomans, all vying for power. Piri became known for his keen memory and his obsession with charts. While most sailors navigated by stars and instinct, Piri drew. He would spend nights sketching coastlines by moonlight, copying foreign maps, comparing distances, recording islands, and noting wind patterns. When his uncle's fleet captured enemy ships, Piri would search them for maps, logbooks, and nautical charts. Sometimes in Italian, sometimes in Portuguese or Spanish. He couldn't read all the languages, but he understood the numbers, the lines, the meaning of shape. Over time, his collection grew, a private archive of maps from across the known world. The fall of Andalusia and the refugee fleet. In 1492, when Spain expelled the last Muslim rulers from Granada, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II ordered Kemal Reis to help rescue Muslim and Jewish refugees fleeing the Inquisition. Piri sailed beside his uncle across the Mediterranean, ferrying hundreds of exiles to safety in Ottoman lands. That mission was more than a humanitarian act, it was also an opportunity. From those fleeing Spain, Piri heard tales of new lands to the west, islands across the ocean, discovered by Christian sailors. It was likely through these encounters that he first heard the name Cologne, Christopher Columbus. Some of the refugees, especially Jewish navigators and scholars from Iberia, had copies or memories of charts Columbus had used, maps that showed strange islands not seen by classical geographers. Piri, already a collector of maps, must have been fascinated. He wrote in his later notes, "The map is drawn from 20 charts and mappa mundi. These are the maps drawn in the time of Alexander, and from 8 maps of the Portuguese and 1 of Columbus." That one sentence, written in Ottoman Turkish on the edge of the Piri Reis map, would later shake the modern world. Because it meant this: Piri had a copy of Columbus's own map of the New World. The making of a cartographer. By 1500, Piri Reis had become one of the Ottoman Empire's most respected navigators. He served in campaigns across the Mediterranean and North Africa, fighting against Venetians and Spanish forces. But his heart remained with maps. Whenever he returned to Gallipoli, he would lock himself away in his study, surrounded by compasses, quadrants, scrolls, and inkpots. He was compiling something extraordinary: a book of navigation, or Kitab Bahriya, a massive guide to the known seas, filled with maps and sailing directions. Each coastline was drawn in stunning color, with detailed instructions for harbors, winds, and currents. But even that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to create something that captured the entire world, not just the Mediterranean, but the new lands everyone whispered about. And so, sometime between 1511 and 1513, he began drawing a world map unlike any other. He used gazelle skin, a durable and precious parchment. He plotted coastlines using a grid system borrowed from the Portuguese and Arabs. He carefully annotated every section in his neat Ottoman handwriting,
describing not just geography, but legends and creatures, strange fish, sea monsters, and exotic animals seen in the newly discovered lands. He titled it simply, Map of the Western Lands drawn by Piri, son of Haji Mehmed, known as Piri Reis, in the month of Muharram, year 919, 1513. What he finished was not just a map, it was a mystery in ink. The secret sources. According to his own writings, Piri Reis did not draw the world from imagination. He claimed to have used over 20 ancient sources, including maps from the time of Alexander the Great, as well as newer ones from Portuguese and Spanish explorers. But where could he have found maps that predated the discovery of the Americas? Historians believe that when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, many Byzantine scholars fled, carrying ancient Greek and Egyptian manuscripts with them. Some ended up in Ottoman libraries, others made their way west, fueling the Renaissance in Europe. It's possible Piri gained access to these forgotten charts through Ottoman archives or through his uncle's captures of European ships. But one thing is certain, some of his sources were older than Columbus. He specifically mentions a map drawn by Columbus, which no longer exists today. Columbus's original chart of his voyages has been lost to history, yet fragments of it, through copies made by others, might have survived in ports like Seville, Lisbon, or Geneva, where the Ottomans had spies and traders. Could Piri have possessed a copy of that lost Columbus map? Very likely. But even Columbus never sailed far enough south to draw the ice-free coastline of Antarctica. So where did that part come from? A map too advanced for its time. When modern cartographers examined the Piri Reis map in the 20th century, they were astonished by its precision. Unlike most maps of its era, it used a spherical projection suggesting an understanding of Earth's curvature. The longitudinal and latitudinal scales were consistent, indicating mathematical accuracy impossible with the instruments of the 1500s. Even more startling, the southern landmass resembled Antarctica's subglacial coast, as revealed by seismic surveys centuries later. That was the part that defied explanation. If Piri was only compiling data from existing maps, those maps themselves must have been drawn from a civilization capable of mapping the world's southern regions thousands of years before modern exploration. Could that be the reason he mentioned sources from the time of Alexander? Was he possibly referring not to Greek maps, but to much older, prehistoric ones? A fall from favor? Despite his brilliance, Piri's career was not one of glory. The Ottoman court was a dangerous place for ambitious men. Politics, betrayal, and the changing tides of power often swallowed great minds whole. In his later years, Piri became a respected admiral of the Ottoman fleet, commanding operations in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. But in 1553, while defending the port of Bakra, he was accused of disobedience and corruption, which were likely exaggerated by rivals jealous of his fame. He was executed in Cairo at nearly 80 years old. His maps and books were scattered, his name nearly forgotten for centuries. Until that fateful day in 1929, when his lost parchment resurfaced and reopened the greatest cartographic mystery in history. A legacy that outlived empires. What makes the Piri Reis map so haunting is not just what it shows, but what it implies. It suggests that somewhere in the depths of forgotten history, there existed a civilization or network of navigators capable of measuring the Earth with astonishing accuracy long before the rise of Rome, long before Columbus set sail, perhaps even before the Ice Age ended. Piri Reis never claimed to have discovered new lands himself. He was a compiler, a man who gathered fragments of lost knowledge and wove them together. But through his ink, the whispers of those ancient mapmakers reached across millennia. In one of his surviving notes, written hungly in the margin of his map, he says, "These lands and seas are drawn according to the accounts of the old times. It is beyond the power of any man to know all the world." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps he knew more than he dared to say. In 1513, when he laid down his pen and watched the ink dry across the smooth gazelle skin, Piri Reis couldn't imagine that 500 years later, people would look at his work and question the very timeline of human civilization. But that is exactly what happened. The Ottoman admiral's legacy did not sail the seas, it sailed through time. When the Piri Reis map first reached Western scholars in the early 20th century, it was considered a curiosity, an Ottoman artifact from a time when maps were more art than science. But as cartographers began to examine it more closely, admiration turned into disbelief. The map, drawn in 1513, didn't just show the familiar outlines of the Old World, Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. It also displayed the coast of South America with shocking accuracy for its time. Even more baffling, along the bottom edge of the map was a massive, curved landmass, an unknown southern continent that no one in 1513 should have known existed. That landmass, with its smooth, continuous coastline, would become the map's most controversial feature: the shape of the impossible. When the map was rediscovered in 1929, it was sent to scholars in Europe and the United States for analysis. One of the earliest Western examinations came from the Library of Congress, which confirmed that the handwriting and style matched Ottoman script from the early 16th century, authentic beyond question. But it wasn't until the 1950s, during the Cold War, that the map truly stunned scientists. A copy had found its way to the U.S. Air Force Cartographic Office, where specialists were conducting advanced studies of global geography using data from aerial and seismic surveys. One analyst, M.I. Walters, compared the lower portion of the Piri Reis map with modern maps of the Antarctic region. What he found seemed, at first, impossible. The shape of the coastline along the bottom of Piri's map, though slightly distorted, matched the subglacial coastline of Queen Maud Land, a section of East Antarctica that lies buried under nearly a mile of ice. At first, the analysts assumed coincidence, but as they overlaid the Piri Reis coastline on modern seismic profiles gathered by the Swedish-British Antarctic Expedition 1949 to 1952, the match became undeniable. This wasn't random. It was accurate. Within a level of error that was astonishing for a 15th century map. In 1960, the U.S. Air Force even issued a formal letter to the Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C., acknowledging the accuracy. The letter stated, "The geographical detail shown in the lower part of the map agrees remarkably with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic Expedition. This indicates that the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap." In other words, the map appeared to show Antarctica as it looked before it was covered in ice. The ice problem. That statement opened a Pandora's box of questions. According to geological evidence, Antarctica has been buried under its ice sheet for at least 6,000 years, possibly as long as 12,000 years. Modern humans had barely begun to develop agriculture at that time.
there were no known civilizations capable of circumnavigating the globe, much less mapping it with such precision. So how could Piri Reis, a 15th century Ottoman admiral, have access to a map showing Antarctica without its ice sheet? The most logical answer was that he must have copied it from older charts, older than the ice itself. That possibility set off a storm of debate among historians, scientists, and even the U.S. military. If true, it meant that some ancient civilization, long before Egypt, Greece, or Sumer, had achieved a global understanding of geography.
And the existence of prehistoric cartographers who somehow measured coastlines and continents thousands of years before known history began. The projection mystery. The map's projection, the way it represented the curved surface of the Earth on flat parchment, added to the puzzle. In the early 1500s, European and Ottoman mapmakers still struggled with global projections. Many maps distorted the poles or stretched continents unnaturally. But the Piri Reis map used what appeared to be a spherical projection centered on the equator, something that wouldn't be mathematically formalized until centuries later. When modern analysts traced the map's projection system, they discovered it used latitudinal corrections consistent with knowledge of Earth's curvature. That would require an understanding of spherical geometry, knowledge of the relative distances between continents, access to precise longitudinal measurements. Yet even in the 18th century, sailors couldn't measure longitude accurately at sea. The first reliable chronometers were still centuries away. So how did Piri's sources do it? Either they possessed a mathematical system for global measurement, or they relied on maps made by people who did. A Cold War curiosity. By the mid-1950s, whispers about the map that shouldn't exist reached higher circles. At the height of the Cold War, when both the US and Soviet Union were obsessed with technological supremacy, even ancient maps became a matter of curiosity or potential concern. If an Ottoman admiral had somehow charted Antarctica 400 years early, what else did the Old World know that modern science had forgotten? The Air Force cartographic section quietly studied it. The CIA reportedly made a copy. The National Geographic Society discussed it in brief, but no one could reach a definitive conclusion. Some suggested that the southern landmass was not Antarctica at all, perhaps just a misdrawn extension of South America. But that theory faltered when satellite imaging, available decades later, revealed that the Piri Reis coastline aligned better with Antarctica's actual continental shape than with any known South American configuration. The more experts examined it, the stranger it became. Ancient echoes in ink. The question then turned toward the maps Piri claimed as his sources. In his own annotation on the parchment, Piri wrote that he had based his chart on, quote-unquote, 20 charts and mappe mundi drawn in the time of Alexander, end quote, and on 8 maps of the Portuguese and 1 of Columbus, end quote. If that statement was literal, then somewhere among the maps from the time of Alexander lay the roots of this mystery. Maps that might have preserved knowledge from even earlier civilizations. Could they have come from the Library of Alexandria before its destruction? Or were they remnants of some older maritime culture, perhaps from the last ice age, when global sea levels were lower and ancient mariners might have explored farther south? Historians dismissed these ideas for decades as pseudoscience, but as satellite and geological studies confirmed the accuracy of the coastline, skepticism began to soften, not into belief in lost continents, but into curiosity about how ancient knowledge survived. Mapping a forgotten world. By the late 20th century, new technologies allowed scientists to see under Antarctica's thick ice. Using radar and seismic mapping, researchers reconstructed what the continent looked like before it froze over. The results matched, incredibly, with sections of the Piri Reis map. It was not a perfect overlay. The distortions made sense for someone copying multiple old maps with different projections,
but the continental proportions and coastal arcs were too close to ignore. Professor Charles Hapgood, a historian from Keene State College, became one of the map's most famous modern defenders. In his book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Hapgood argued that the Piri Reis map and others like it were copies of a much older world map created by an unknown seafaring civilization that predated recorded history. He theorized that this civilization may have existed during the last ice age, and that fragments of its cartographic knowledge survived through Egyptian and Greek scholars, eventually reaching the Ottoman world. Even Albert Einstein, in correspondence with Hapgood, acknowledged the hypothesis as interesting and not impossible. Einstein wrote, "The idea of the shifting of the Earth's crust sounds strange, but if it's true, it could explain many geological and historical puzzles." Though Einstein never fully endorsed the ancient civilization theory, his openness gave the discussion a measure of credibility few others could. A message across time. The most haunting part of the Piri Reis map isn't its coastline, or its projection, or even its mysterious accuracy. It's what it symbolizes. It's a message across centuries, passed hand to hand through cultures, languages, and empires, from unknown ancient cartographers to Greek scholars, from Arabs to Ottomans, from sailors to scientists. Piri himself likely had no idea what he was truly preserving. To him, it was simply a compilation of the best knowledge available. But to us, it's a window into a lost chapter of humanity, one that hints we've forgotten more than we know. In the end, the impossible coastline remains just that, impossible, at least within our current understanding of history. But every time a scientist overlays modern data on Piri Reis's parchment, and the lines align, ice-free Antarctica to 16th century ink, one can't help but feel a shiver of awe. Because sometimes, history doesn't whisper. It reminds us that the world is far older, deeper, and stranger than we dare to imagine. The Piri Reis map, for all its breathtaking precision, was never meant to be mysterious. Its creator, the Ottoman admiral and scholar Piri Reis, openly admitted he had copied it from older sources. But how old those sources were and where they came from has become one of the greatest riddles in historical cartography. Piri himself wrote directly on the parchment, quote-unquote, "This map is composed from 20 charts and mappe mundi drawn in the time of Alexander," end quote, and on 8 maps of the Portuguese and 1 of Columbus, end quote. To most historians, that line reads like a confession. He was not the original discoverer, but the last guardian of knowledge already ancient in his time. If that's true, then the true origin of the Piri Reis map lies not in the Ottoman world, nor in Columbus's voyages, but in antiquity itself. 1. The maps of Alexander. When Piri mentioned maps drawn in the time of Alexander, he likely referred to the Hellenistic period, the era following Alexander the Great's conquests, 4th century BCE. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India and Egypt. His generals, especially those who ruled Egypt afterward, the Ptolemies, were obsessed with science, exploration, and geography. They built the Library of Alexandria, the greatest center of learning the ancient world had ever known. It was in that library that Greek scholars like Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, and Ptolemy mapped the Earth with astonishing mathematical precision. Eratosthenes, using nothing but shadows and geometry, calculated the Earth's circumference in 240 BCE and came within 1% of the modern value. If maps from the time of Alexander survived in some form, they could have contained coastlines and regions now lost to time, preserved through Greek, Roman, or Arabic translations. When the Library of Alexandria burned, in waves of destruction over centuries, many of its documents were scattered across the Mediterranean. Some were saved by scholars in Byzantium. Others were translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, when Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became new centers of knowledge. It's possible that by the time Piri lived, these ancient charts, copied and recopied for centuries, were stored in Ottoman archives, still containing traces of knowledge from civilizations long gone. 2. The legacy of the library.
Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building, it was the brain of the ancient world. Founded around 283 BCE by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals, it held manuscripts from Greece, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and India. Ancient accounts describe ship captains being forced to surrender any maps or scrolls they carried when docking in Alexandria. The originals were copied by scholars, and the copies returned, but the originals were kept. If even a fraction of those maps survived into later centuries, they would represent a repository of global geographical knowledge accumulated from every civilization of the ancient world. Consider this. Ancient Egyptian sailors, Phoenician merchants, and Carthaginian explorers may have charted coastlines far beyond the Mediterranean. There are hints in Greek and Roman writings that the ancients reached as far as West Africa and possibly even the Americas. What if the Alexandrian library preserved those records? And what if through centuries of conquest, copies eventually found their way to Ottoman hands? Piri's own empire stood on land that had once been part of Alexander's. The chain of transmission isn't just plausible, it's almost inevitable. 3. The Arab custodians of knowledge. Between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Ottomans, another great empire became the guardian of human learning, the Islamic Caliphate. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, Muslim scholars collected, translated, and expanded upon Greek and Roman works. Astronomers, geographers, and mathematicians in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo charted the heavens and the earth with unprecedented sophistication. The geographer Al-Idrisi in the 12th century created a silver world map for the Norman king of Sicily. His map, Tabula Rogeriana, was the most accurate of its time, and it depicted parts of Africa and Asia with detail unmatched in Europe for another 300 years. By the 15th century, copies of such works circulated across the Muslim world, including in Ottoman ports like Gallipoli, where Piri was born. It is entirely possible that Piri had access to these Islamic-era maps, themselves derived from older Greek and Egyptian sources, a lineage stretching back nearly 2,000 years. But that still doesn't explain one haunting question. How did any of them know about the Antarctic coast? 4. The ancient sea kings theory. In the mid-20th century, historian Charles Hapgood proposed a radical idea in his book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, 1966. He argued that the Piri Reis map, along with a handful of other ancient charts, such as the Orontius Finus map and the Buash map, were copies of a single lost master map created by a civilization capable of global navigation thousands of years before known history. Hapgood theorized that this civilization existed before the end of the last ice age, perhaps around 10,000 BCE, when sea levels were lower and the Antarctic coast was free of ice. He called them the ancient sea kings. According to Hapgood, their advanced understanding of geometry and astronomy allowed them to measure Earth's curvature and chart coastlines accurately. When their civilization was wiped out by cataclysmic floods, possibly those that ended the Ice Age, their knowledge survived in fragments, handed down through Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Centuries later, when explorers like Columbus and Piri began charting the world, they unknowingly used traces of this ancient knowledge. It sounded outrageous, but Hapgood backed it with data. He compared dozens of old maps, noting that many used similar projections and referenced coastlines that could only have been visible in an ice-free world. Even Albert Einstein, intrigued by Hapgood's work, wrote in his foreword, "These ideas are not to be dismissed lightly. They show that there may be more to our historical knowledge of mankind than we have yet discovered." 5. Could Atlantis have been real? For centuries, the legend of Atlantis, first recorded by Plato, was dismissed as myth. But the Piri Reis map revived an unsettling thought.
What if Plato's story was a memory of a real civilization destroyed by floods and earthquakes at the end of the Ice Age? If the ancient sea kings were real, perhaps they were the remnants of that lost civilization, the cartographers who once mapped a world that looked very different from today's. Hapgood's students pointed out that many ancient myths, from Mesopotamia's flood story to the Egyptian Zep-Tepi, the first time, described catastrophic global changes around 10,000 BCE, the same period when Antarctica became entombed in ice. Could it be that those stories preserved cultural memories of real events, the fall of an ancient seafaring civilization whose maps somehow endured, copied and recopied until they reached men like Piri Reis? It's speculation, yes, but speculation born of startling evidence. 6. The chain of knowledge. Imagine the journey of that knowledge through time. Around 10,000 BCE, a seafaring civilization maps coastlines of a world different from ours. 3000 BCE, their knowledge is absorbed by early Egyptians or Mesopotamians, recorded in stone or papyrus. 300 BCE, Greek scholars in Alexandria translate ancient geographic data, adding mathematical precision. 800 AD, Islamic astronomers preserve and expand upon these ideas, creating detailed world charts. 1500 AD, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, inheritor of that long tradition, compiles fragments into a map that once again shows the full face of Earth. And then silence. The knowledge lost again until its rediscovery in 1929. If true, then Piri's map wasn't the beginning of the mystery. It was the echo of something much older, a whisper from humanity's forgotten past. 7. Skeptics and defenders. Of course, mainstream historians reject Hapgood's theory. They argue that the resemblance between Piri's southern continent and Antarctica could be coincidental. A misdrawn South America extended too far south. They point out that early explorers often included imaginary lands in their maps. Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land that many believed must exist to balance the globe. And yet, the precision of certain details continues to defy simple explanation. For every skeptic who calls it coincidence, another scholar quietly admits it's too good to dismiss entirely. 8. The ghost in the ink. When Piri Reis wrote that he used maps from the time of Alexander, he was likely unaware that he was preserving something much deeper, a ghost of knowledge that had already survived thousands of years of darkness. He was a collector, not a prophet, a compiler, not a mystic, yet somehow, through his ink and parchment, humanity glimpsed a truth too vast to fit neatly into history books. Perhaps the Piri Reis map is not proof of a lost civilization. Perhaps it's only evidence that human knowledge is never truly lost, only buried, waiting to be rediscovered. When the Piri Reis map was rediscovered in 1929, it fascinated historians. But by the 1950s, an age obsessed with exploration and secrecy, it caught the attention of an entirely different audience: scientists and military analysts. The Second World War had just ended. Radar, sonar, and aerial photography had revealed a world invisible to the naked eye. The Cold War had begun, and Antarctica, a continent twice the size of the United States, was the next frontier. The U.S. Navy launched Operation High Jump, 1946-74, a massive Antarctic expedition led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Officially, it was a scientific mission. Unofficially, it was a strategic one, to map and claim territory in the last unclaimed continent. Then, as those missions gathered data, something curious happened. Analysts comparing ancient maps noticed that the Piri Reis chart seemed to show
This is the true, astonishing, and deeply American story of the Radium Girls, a tale of scientific miracle turned deadly curse, of corporate greed against human life, and of a landmark legal battle that fundamentally changed worker safety laws in the United States, all while an even darker secret about the element lay hidden in the nation's future. The ghost in the parlor and the miracle paint. The year is 1927. The city is Orange, New Jersey. The young woman is Grace Fryer. and she is already a living ghost. At 23, Grace was a former dial painter for the United States Radium Corporation, a company that had made its fortune off a substance the world had embraced as a modern marvel, radium. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, radium glowed with an eerie, beautiful, self-sustaining light, an almost magical property that promised a new era of science and industry. It was marketed in everything from toothpaste to cosmetics to tonics and chocolate, celebrated as a cure-all, a source of vital energy, and the very essence of modernity. USRC's product, however, was its luminous paint, branded Undark. Its key application was in the watches, clocks, and instrument dials needed by the American military, especially as the nation ramped up for the First World War. This radioactive material allowed pilots to read altimeters in the dark and soldiers to check the time on their wrists. Grace and hundreds of other young women, known as the Radium Girls, were the workforce that made this possible. The work was delicate, painting tiny numbers onto watch faces with the Undark paint. To achieve a fine point on the delicate camel hair brushes, the factory supervisors instructed the girls to perform a technique called lip pointing or tipping, a quick lick of the brush tip to shape it before dipping it back into the deadly, glowing mixture. They were told the paint was harmless. It was merely a rare, expensive compound. "Don't worry," the chemists would assure them, "it will make you beautiful." In a perverse, tragic sense, it did. The girls literally glowed when they walked home at night, the radium dust clinging to their clothes and hair. They would sometimes paint their teeth or fingernails for a special spooky effect for a date, utterly unaware that the beautiful light was the light of their own death sentence. The truth was horrifying. Every time they licked the brush, they ingested a microscopic dose of radium. This alpha-emitting element, chemically similar to calcium, made a beeline for their bones. Once lodged, it acted like an internal atomic furnace, firing continuous high-energy particles into the surrounding tissue, destroying bone marrow, causing severe anemia, and riddling the skeletal structure with holes and necrotic tissue. By 1927, Grace Fryer could barely walk. Her spine was crumbling. Her friend, Irene Rudolph, had died 2 years prior from a massive internal hemorrhage, a death the company dismissed as a separate illness. USRC, aware since as early as 1924 of the connection between the radium and the girls' catastrophic health, had engaged in a silent, chilling conspiracy of denial. They commissioned secret studies that confirmed the lethal link, then suppressed the results, falsified documentation, and actively misled the medical community and the press. Grace, determined not to die silently, began her quest for justice, a path that would lead to one of the most significant legal battles in American labor history. The litigation of the living dead. Finding a lawyer was an arduous task. 5 firms turned Grace down, intimidated by the power and wealth of the USRC. The case was unprecedented. The injuries were invisible and drawn out. The element of radioactive poisoning completely new to jurisprudence. Finally, Grace and 4 of her former co-workers, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Laris, found their champion in a young, determined lawyer named Raymond Barry. The sensational nature of the case quickly captured the American public's attention. It was nicknamed the Case of the Living Dead. The media coverage was often morbid but effective, highlighting the incredible tragedy of young, working-class women being destroyed by a product they helped create, all for a $7 a day wage. The USRC's defense was a masterclass in callous corporate obstruction. They employed delay tactics, hoping the women would die before the case could be settled. The company lawyers filed motion after motion. The judge presiding over the case adjourned the proceedings until the autumn, a move that felt like a death sentence to the increasingly frail plaintiffs. The women were so ill that they could barely raise their hands to take the oath. They could not sit in the courtroom for long periods. Their bones were literally dissolving, yet their courage was unwavering. The legal battle of 1928 was a race against time, a desperate fight for a settlement that would ensure their families were cared for after their inevitable deaths. In the end, the sheer weight of public opinion, combined with the irrefutable medical evidence presented by the few honest scientists, forced the USRC to concede. A highly publicized settlement was reached out of court. Each woman would receive a lump sum of $10,000, which was equivalent to over $180,000 today, a $600 annual annuity for life, and coverage for all past and future medical and legal expenses. While the settlement was modest in light of the women's suffering, it was a monumental victory. It was the first time an American corporation was held responsible for the effects of radiation exposure on its workers. The legacy of Grace Fryer and the original Radium Girls was the establishment of the right of individual workers to sue for damages from occupational disease, a foundational shift in labor law that predated the later more broad regulations. The story, however, was far from over. The radium's deadly work continued, and the ultimate horrifying reach of the element was yet to be revealed to the American public. The Secret Scrutiny and the Manhattan Project. The Orange, New Jersey case was a landmark, but the radium industry simply moved its operations, often to towns like Ottawa, Illinois, where the tragedy repeated itself. There, workers like Catherine Donahue would continue the fight in the 1930s, cementing the legal precedents set by the first group. These second-generation radium girls, like Donahue, fought their case while confined to their beds, dictating their testimony until the very end. But the story holds an astonishing twist that connects the fate of these factory workers to the most powerful and secretive scientific endeavor in U.S. history, the Manhattan Project. In the 1940s, as America secretly raced to build the atomic bomb, the government scientists and military leadership needed to know everything they could about the effects of radiation on the human body. The bomb would release vast amounts of radioactive isotopes, and the workers creating the bomb, the technicians, physicists, and engineers, would be exposed to unprecedented doses. Where did they turn for human data? They turned, chillingly, to the Radium Girls. The skeletons of the dead dial painters and the fragile living bodies of the survivors became the most important human case studies in the history of radiation toxicology. A secretive program, the Manhattan Project's Health Division, began the exhaustive, lifelong study of the remaining Radium Girls. This was a profound ethical gray area. The women, who had suffered horrific internal contamination from a single ingested element, were now being scrutinized by the very government that was weaponizing a far more catastrophic form of the same invisible force. Scientists, most notably Dr. Rubley Evans at MIT, developed techniques like the radon breath test and total body gamma measurements to quantify the exact amount of radium lodged in the workers' bodies. For the first time, researchers were able to link specific doses of ingested radium to the resulting pathology, the cancers, the necrosis, and the skeletal damage. This research, funded and controlled by the Manhattan Project, was not for academic curiosity, it was for protection. The data gathered from the suffering of the Radium Girls provided the crucial threshold for safety standards, allowing scientists to calculate the maximum permissible body burden of radiation for the thousands of workers who would go on to handle enriched uranium, plutonium, and other highly radioactive materials during the Cold War.
The glow remains. Today, the USRC factory in Orange, New Jersey, is long gone, but the environmental contamination remains a Superfund site. Even more remarkably, the remains of the Radium Girls themselves still glow faintly in their caskets, a testament to the element's astonishingly long half-life. The story of the Radium Girls is astonishingly American. It is a story of innovation, the luminous dial, capitalism, the ruthless suppression of scientific truth for profit, courage, the women's fight for justice, and unforeseen scientific consequence, the link to the atomic age.
It is a true tale that is both historical and timeless, a cautionary account of a beautiful, deadly light that illuminated the dark underbelly of American industrial progress. Their legal battle set the stage for the modern worker safety standards that every American now takes for granted. They were not generals or presidents or captains of industry, but young, working-class women who faced down a corporate giant and in doing so forged a legacy that is literally carved into the foundational documents of American labor law and, more surprisingly, into the very origins of nuclear safety science. The year is 1927. The city is Orange, New Jersey, and the young woman is Grace Fryer, and she is already a living ghost. At 23, Grace was a former dial painter for the United States Radium Corporation, USRC, a company that had made its fortune off a substance the world had embraced as a modern marvel, radium. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, radium glowed with an eerie, beautiful, self-sustaining light, an almost magical property that promised a new era of science and industry. It was marketed in everything from toothpaste and cosmetics to tonics and chocolate, celebrated as a cure-all, a source of vital energy, and the very essence of modernity. USRC's product, however, was its luminous paint, branded Undark. Its key application was in the watches, clocks, and instrument dials needed by the American military, especially as the nation ramped up for the First World War. This radioactive material allowed pilots to read altimeters in the dark, and soldiers to check the time on their wrists. The work was seen as crucial to the war effort, a patriotic duty. Grace and hundreds of other young women, known collectively as the Radium Girls, were the workforce that made this possible. The job itself was meticulous, painting tiny, precise numbers onto watch faces with the Undark paint. To achieve the absolute finest point on the delicate camel hair brushes, factory supervisors instructed the girls to perform a technique they called lip pointing or tipping, a quick lick of the brush tip to shape it before dipping it back into the deadly glowing mixture. They were told the paint was harmless, merely a rare, expensive compound. Don't worry, the chemists would assure them. It will make you beautiful. In a perverse, tragic sense, it did. The girls literally glowed when they walked home at night, the radium dust clinging to their clothes and hair. They would sometimes paint their teeth or fingernails for a special, spooky effect for a date, utterly unaware that the beautiful light was the light of their own death sentence. The truth, known to the company's executives and chief scientists, was horrifying. Every time they licked the brush, they ingested a microscopic dose of radium. This alpha-emitting element, chemically similar to calcium, made a beeline for their bones. Once lodged, it acted like an internal atomic furnace, firing continuous high-energy particles into the surrounding tissue. It destroyed bone marrow, causing severe anemia, and riddled the skeletal structure with holes and necrotic tissue. The first symptoms were often dismissed as minor, debilitating toothaches, followed by loose teeth, gum inflammation, and eventually a horrifying condition known as radium jaw, the disintegration of the jawbone itself. Then came the severe anemia, the bone cancers, and the brittle, fracturing bones. By 1927, Grace Fryer could barely walk. Her spine was crumbling, and she faced an agonizing, slow death. Her friend, Irene Rudolph, had died 2 years prior from a massive internal hemorrhage, a death the company had successfully dismissed as a separate illness like syphilis. The USRC, aware since as early as 1924 of the connection between the radium and the girl's catastrophic health,
had engaged in a silent, chilling conspiracy of denial. They commissioned secret studies that confirmed the lethal link, then suppressed the results, falsified documentation, and actively misled the medical community and the press. The doctors they hired often blamed the girl's symptoms on outside diseases to protect the company's reputation and bottom line. Grace, determined not to die silently, began her quest for justice, a path that would lead to one of the most significant legal battles in American labor history: the litigation of the living dead. English. Finding a lawyer was an arduous task. 5 different firms turned Grace down, intimidated by the immense power and wealth of the USRC. The case was unprecedented. The injuries were internal, slow, and drawn out, the element of radioactive poisoning completely new to jurisprudence. Finally, Grace and 4 of her former co-workers, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta McDonald, and Albina Lariefs, found their champion in a young, determined, and deeply ethical lawyer named Raymond Barry. The sensational nature of the case quickly captured the American public's attention. It was nicknamed the Case of the Living Dead. The media coverage was intense, highlighting the incredible tragedy of young, working-class women being destroyed by a product they helped create, all for a minimal wage. It was a clear-cut David versus Goliath scenario where the Goliath Corporation had used the women as unwitting test subjects. The USRC's defense was a masterclass in callous corporate obstruction. They employed relentless delay tactics, hoping the women would succumb to their illness before a verdict could be reached. The company lawyers filed motion after motion. The judge presiding over the case, seemingly overwhelmed by the medical complexity, adjourned the proceedings until the autumn, a move that felt like a death sentence to the increasingly frail plaintiffs. The women were so ill that they could barely raise their hands to take the oath. They could not sit in the courtroom for long periods. Their bones were literally dissolving, riddled with cancerous tumors. They were advised by doctors that their time was measured in months. Yet their courage was unwavering. They understood that their fight was not for their own lives, which were already lost, but for the future safety of all American workers. The legal battle of 1928 became a desperate race against time, a fight for a settlement that would ensure their families were cared for after their inevitable deaths. The press, particularly the New York World, began publishing furious, damning articles about the USRC's moral culpability. The sheer weight of public opinion, combined with the irrefutable medical evidence presented by the few honest scientists and the detailed gamma measurements of the women's bodies, finally forced USRC to concede. A highly publicized settlement was reached out of court. Each of the first original women would receive a lump sum of $10,000, equivalent to over $180,000 today, a $600 annual annuity for life, and coverage for all past and future medical and legal expenses. While the financial settlement was modest, in light of the women's suffering and the company's deceit, the legal and social victory was monumental. It was the first time an American corporation was held responsible for the effects of radiation exposure on its workers. The legacy of Grace Fryer and the original Radium Girls was the establishment of the right of individual workers to sue for damages from occupational disease, a foundational shift in labor law that preceded the later, more broad regulations of the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, OSHA. Their testimony also led to the gradual closure of the radium dial painting industry and spurred the creation of the first safety standards for handling radioactive materials. But the story holds an even more profound, astonishing twist that connects the fate of these factory workers to the most powerful and secretive scientific endeavor in U.S. history. Secret Scrutiny and the Manhattan Project, English. The Orange, New Jersey case was a landmark, But the deadly work continued. The radium industry simply moved its operations often to towns like Ottawa, Illinois, where the tragedy repeated.
This
moral
research,
reckoning,
however,
funded and
was reserved
by
for
the Manhattan
scientists.
Project,
In
was not for
1945,
academic
as
curiosity.
the final
It was
materials
for
were being
protection.
processed at Oak
The
Ridge
data
and
gathered
delivered
from
to
the
Los
suffering
Alamos,
of the radium
the
girls
scientists there
provided the
began to
crucial
grapple with
threshold
the
for safety
reality of what
standards,
they had created.
allowing scientists
J.
to
Robert
calculate
Oppenheimer,
the, quote,
the
maximum
brilliant, troubled
permissible body
scientific
burden
director,
of radiation
saw the moral
for the
chasm
thousands
opening
of
up
workers
before
who
them.
would go on to
A
handle
growing number
enriched
of
uranium,
scientists,
plutonium,
particularly those
and
who
other
had fled
highly radioactive
persecution in Europe,
materials during
such
the
as
Cold
Leo
War.
Szilard, who had
In a
drafted the original
breathtaking,
letter to
almost
Roosevelt,
unbelievable
became
arc of
deeply
history,
distressed.
the corporate
They knew
greed
the
that
war in
destroyed
Europe
the
was ending.
lives of the young
Germany
dial
was
painters
defeated in May
ultimately
1945.
provided the scientific
The original
bedrock for the
motivation
safety
to
protocols
prevent
of the
Hitler from
atomic
getting the
age.
bomb first
The
was
tragic,
gone.
slow deaths of the radium
Szilard
girls,
organized a
documented
petition
in
among the
meticulous
scientists,
detail by secret government
advocating
files,
for a demonstration
saved
of the bomb's
countless
power
lives
to the
in
Japanese
nuclear
military
laboratories, power
before
plants,
dropping it on
and
a city.
defense industries that
He
followed.
and his colleagues
Their
believed that if
story
the
is
American government
astonishingly
fully
American.
understood the
A story
apocalyptic
of
nature of
reckless
the weapon,
innovation,
they would
ruthless
hesitate to use it,
capitalism,
perhaps
immense
saving
personal
humanity
courage,
from the coming
and a
nuclear
shocking,
age.
unexpected
The
link
petition
to the
never
nation's
reached President
greatest
Truman.
scientific secret.
General Groves and the
They were
military
not
command
generals or
ensured it
presidents,
was held
but
back,
young women
buried
who,
in the
with their
layers of
glowing
wartime
brushes,
bureaucracy and secrecy.
illuminated the path
The
toward
die had
modern
already
worker
been
safety.
cast. Billions had been spent. Years of effort had been expended. The political and military momentum for using the new weapon was unstoppable. V. The end of the secret. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the day the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima, Japan, an extraordinary announcement was made over the public address systems at Oak Ridge. For the first time, the 45,000 residents were told the truth. The official government statement revealed that the Clinton Engineer Works was the primary production center for the nuclear materials used in the bomb. The workers, the plumbers, the cafeteria cooks, the technicians, and the engineers suddenly realized they were not just making Q stuff, or the product. They were not just a crucial part of the war effort, they had been the essential engine for the single most transformative event in human history. The reaction was a dizzying mix of elation, pride, and profound shock. Many celebrated, believing they had ended the war and saved the lives of countless American soldiers who would have otherwise been part of an invasion of Japan. But for many others, the revelation brought a sickening realization of the true scale of their secret labor. A newspaper headline from the time captures the mood. "What we're making? It's a bomb." The story of Oak Ridge didn't end with the war. The second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later, compelling Japan's surrender. The Manhattan Project had succeeded beyond all expectation, but the city's secrecy had created a lasting, complex legacy. The vast government complex remained, evolving into a center for national defense and energy research. The former ghost town became a permanent fixture of the American landscape, known as the Atomic City. The greatest revelation of the entire ordeal was the terrifying proof of concept. The secret city proved that a massive industrial and scientific enterprise could be kept almost entirely hidden in a functioning, open democracy. It was a testament to the power of government secrecy, the loyalty of a wartime population, and the willingness of individuals to compartmentalize their entire lives for a shared, unknown purpose. In the long shadow of the Cold War, Oak Ridge stood as a permanent monument to a moral and scientific paradox. The ingenuity that built the city and its colossal plants also ushered in the nuclear age, forever changing the nature of warfare, diplomacy, and the survival of the species. The people of the ghost town that built the apocalypse were left to live in the world they had secretly created, a world of astonishing power and perpetual existential danger. Their story remains a unique and sobering chapter in American history, an essential reminder of the profound ethical weight that comes with technological triumph. The following narrative, exceeding 2,000 words, is a historical true story designed to be astonishing, informative, and engaging for a U.S. audience. The improbable voyage of Henry Box Brown, a man who mailed himself to freedom. Imagine this. You are a fugitive, a piece of living property worth a king's ransom, hunted by a system designed to crush the hope of freedom from your very soul.
You have no allies but the shadows, and no escape route but a long, impossible road patrolled by men who believe your life is their right. What is your most desperate, most outlandish plan? To ship yourself, to literally become freight, to willingly entrust your life to the most mundane yet most powerful vehicle of the American economy, a wooden crate, nailed shut and sent via express mail. This is the true, astonishing story of Henry Brown, a man whose determination was so radical, so utterly audacious, that he forced the world to acknowledge his humanity by treating himself as mere chattel for one final, terrifying journey. He would become known to history as Henry Box Brown. Part 1. The crushing weight of property. Henry Brown was born enslaved in Louisa County, Virginia, around 1815. Unlike the stereotypical narrative of the plantation field hand, Henry's early life was marked by a relative, though utterly conditional, comfort. He was owned by the family of Major John Barrett, and as a boy, he worked primarily in the great house as a servant. This proximity to the white world meant that he learned a degree of literacy and developed a quick, sharp intellect, skills that would ultimately aid his escape. When Major Barrett died, Henry, like all the Major's other possessions, was willed to his son William. In 1830, William moved to Richmond, Virginia, taking the 15-year-old Henry with him. Richmond was a hub of industry, but it was also the grim heart of the domestic slave trade, second only to New Orleans in its scope. Here, the brutal economic reality of slavery was impossible to ignore. Enslaved individuals were bought and sold like furniture, their value fluctuating with the price of tobacco and cotton. Despite this omnipresent threat, Henry was allowed to hire out his time to a tobacco factory owner, which gave him a sliver of autonomy. He saved a small amount of money, and in 1836 he met and married Nancy, an enslaved woman owned by another man. The couple had 3 children. For over a decade, Henry and Nancy built a life, a fragile bubble of love and hope in a place where such things were technically illegal for them to own. They knew that at any moment, the law, the brutal, uncompromising law of property, could tear their world apart. That moment arrived in 1848. Nancy's owner, a man with a penchant for gambling debts and sudden, cruel decisions, sold her and their 3 children to a different slave trader. The sale was carried out with chilling efficiency. Henry rushed to the broker's office, pleading to purchase his own family, offering every cent he had scraped together, even going so far as to ask his employer to intercede. The slave trader, however, saw only a higher price offered by a buyer in North Carolina. The last time Henry saw his wife and children was as they were being loaded onto a chain gang bound for the Deep South, a separation often referred to as a death in the context of slavery, final and absolute. The event did not just break Henry, it fundamentally altered him. It was a trauma so profound that it hardened into an absolute, radical resolve. He would be free, or he would die trying. For weeks, Henry was consumed by a grief that rendered him useless. He walked the streets of Richmond in a daze, unable to work, unable to eat. His loss was a constant physical agony. It was during this period of utter despair that the seed of his absurd, magnificent plan was planted. Part 2. The plan of utter madness. Richmond, Virginia, in the mid-19th century, was connected to the free states of the North by a sophisticated network of canals, railroads, and shipping lines. These lines were the arteries of American commerce, delivering cotton, tobacco, and goods to the rapidly industrializing North. Henry, standing one day near the docks, watched a consignment of goods being loaded onto a train, a shipment headed to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a beacon of abolition and freedom. It was then, in a flash of manic inspiration, that the idea formed. If they treated him as property, then as property he would travel. The plan was audacious to the point of being suicidal. He would have to find a Confederate, a free man or abolitionist willing to risk imprisonment and death to help him, acquire a box, a sturdy, custom-made container that would not break under the stress of transit, endure the transit, a long, grueling journey of approximately 350 miles, 560 kilometers, across land and water in utter darkness, silence, and physical confinement. Finding an accomplice was the first hurdle. Henry initially approached his friend James C.A. Smith, a free black shoemaker. Smith was initially horrified, calling the plan too rash, but Henry's conviction, his absolute refusal to live another day in bondage after the loss of his family, eventually swayed Smith. Smith introduced Henry to Samuel A. Smith, a white shoemaker and known gambler, who surprisingly agreed to help, perhaps for the promise of payment or simply for the thrill of the extraordinary risk. Together, they set out to execute the plan with meticulous detail. The three purchased pine boards and constructed a crate. Henry dictated the precise dimensions: 3 feet long, 2 feet 8 inches deep, and 2 feet wide, just enough space for his 5-foot 8-inch frame to curl up. They lined the crate with coarse woolen cloth and punched a single, small air hole.
The date was set for March 29, 1849. Part 3. The Journey of Terrors. The morning of the escape, a terrifying ritual was performed. Henry and his 2 accomplices met in Samuel Smith's rented room. Henry, having bid a silent farewell to the only world he had ever known, climbed into the box. James Smith hammered down the lid, securing Henry inside. He was now a commodity, a piece of cargo, a secret wrapped in wood. The box was loaded onto a dray cart and taken to the Adams Express Company office in Richmond. Adams Express, a predecessor to modern FedEx or UPS, was renowned for its speed and reliability, qualities Henry desperately needed. The shippers, James and Samuel Smith, paid the freight charge of $34.50, an enormous sum for the time, nearly all of Henry's remaining savings, and the box was accepted for immediate delivery. The Odyssey began. The first trauma struck almost immediately. Despite the clear markings this side up, the expressmen, focused on stacking cargo efficiently, picked up the box and flipped it completely upside down. Henry later recounted the agony. "My eyes were swollen and full of blood. My head ached intensely, and the pressure was so great that I supposed that the blood vessels of my brain had all burst. I felt as though I was in a terrible dream from which I was unable to wake." He endured this inverted position, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. Hours later, the train pulled into its first stop, and the box was set upright, likely to allow another piece of freight to be moved. The relief was instantaneous. The journey was a masterclass in silent suffering. The box was taken from the train and placed on a steamship which sailed north up the Chesapeake Bay. Henry was exposed to the rocking of the ship, the continuous jarring vibrations of the engines, and the loud, indifferent chatter of the crew. His greatest fear was not death, but discovery. If found, he faced an unimaginable fate: torture, a sail to the most remote plantation, and a public spectacle that would crush the Underground Railroad movement for years. At one point, 2 stevedores, curious about the odd light box, used it as a seat, resting their full weight on his head for what felt like hours. He could hear their voices, feel their weight, but dared not make a sound lest he revealed the perishable cargo was, in fact, a terrified living man. The steamship eventually docked in Baltimore, Maryland, another slave state where the risk of discovery was the highest. The box was transferred to another train, bound for the final leg to Philadelphia. By this point, Henry had been in the box for over 24 hours. His muscles had seized, his body was numb, the air inside was stale, and his small flask of water was long gone. Every cough, every involuntary spasm of pain was a threat to his life. Part 4. The Arrival and the Unsealing. Finally, on the morning of March 30th, 1849, after exactly 27 hours of transit, the box arrived at the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society office. In the office, waiting anxiously, were members of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee.
including the famous abolitionist William Still, who would later record the details of Henry's escape in his historical records of the Underground Railroad. They had received coded instructions from Richmond about the cargo and were prepared for an early delivery. The moment the box was placed in the office, the abolitionists gathered around it, their excitement and tension palpable. They had a hammer and a chisel ready, but before they broke the seal, a moment of profound, almost religious gravity occurred. William Still later wrote, "All was quiet. The witnesses held their breath. William Still bent over the box and gave 3 distinct raps on the lid. There was a moment of silence. Then, a voice, muffled but clear, responded from inside the box. 'Is all right?' The relief was overwhelming. The answer, delivered with choked emotion, was a single word: 'All right.' They quickly began to pry open the lid. The atmosphere was part birthing, part resurrection. When the final nails were removed and the lid was lifted, Henry Brown slowly rose from the cramped space. He was disoriented, his face swollen, his body aching, but he was alive. His first words, spoken with a voice of absolute certainty, were a prayer of thanks. "I have been delivered from the dark prison of slavery." He was a free man. The men in the room broke into a chorus of the hymn, "Behold a Stranger at the Door." William Still noted that Henry's body bore a message far more powerful than any printed pamphlet. The sight of his emergence was a more convincing argument against slavery than 1,000 speeches. Part 5. A Life as a Free Man and the Cost of Fame. Henry Brown's escape instantly became an international sensation. He was given the name Henry Box Brown and was celebrated as a living testament to the human spirit's refusal to be broken. His tale was a powerful, undeniable propaganda tool for the abolitionist movement. It proved that enslaved people were not content with their lot and that they were capable of revolutionary self-liberation. However, his fame came with a steep price. The details of his escape, the box's dimensions, the route, and the involvement of his 2 accomplices were so widely publicized that they compromised the Underground Railroad. The Adams Express Company, furious that their service had been used to steal property, announced they would henceforth scrutinize every shipment leaving the South, effectively closing the Box Express route forever. Worse, Henry's accomplices were not so lucky. Samuel A. Smith, the white shoemaker, was arrested when he attempted to ship another person to freedom. Under torture, he betrayed James C. A. Smith, the free black shoemaker. Both men were convicted and served long sentences in the Richmond Penitentiary. The cost of Henry's freedom was their imprisonment. Knowing he was now too high profile to remain safely in the United States, especially after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which legally compelled free states to return runaways, Henry Brown relocated to England. In the UK, Henry capitalized on his fame. He published his memoir, Narrative of Henry Box Brown, who escaped from slavery enclosed in a box 3 feet long and 2 wide, and began a career as a celebrated speaker and entertainer. He developed a highly popular stage show where, to the amazement of Victorian audiences, he would reenact his own escape, emerging triumphantly from a custom-made box on stage. He was not just telling a story, he was performing his survival. Henry eventually married a second time and spent over 20 years touring in the United Kingdom, becoming a well-known figure in the world of abolition and entertainment. He was one of the most visible self-emancipated individuals of the era, living proof of the injustice and the ingenuity born from American slavery. The last reliable historical records place him in Toronto, Canada, where he performed as late as 1889, nearly 40 years after his great escape. His date and place of death remain uncertain, a final fitting mystery for a man whose life began in bondage and who disappeared into the freedom he had so miraculously earned. Conclusion. Henry Box Brown's improbable voyage is more than a thrilling anecdote. It is a profound material indictment of a nation's foundational hypocrisy. In 1849, the United States Constitution explicitly defined Henry Brown as property, but on March 30th, 1849, by reducing himself to a piece of freight, Henry Brown ironically achieved his full, radical humanity. He was not freed by a benevolent master or rescued by an organization. He took his freedom by an act of sheer, almost unbelievable will. He forced the American system to transport him from a slave society to a free one, using its own commercial infrastructure against itself.
To achieve this, Stone did two things that became the core of the mystery. 1. The revolutionary ships. Stone commissioned the construction of specialized, large-capacity schooners and steamships built specifically to handle the massive, rough iron ore and withstand the unique, savage weather patterns of Lake Superior. These ships were revolutionary for the time, a private armada built for speed and endurance. 2. The phantom cargo. To finance the final difficult years of the Sulak's construction and to give his company an insurmountable lead, Stone orchestrated a secret venture. Alongside the massive iron ore shipments, he began to move smaller, much more valuable cargo. This cargo was said to be not just gold and silver bullion, extracted from a newly discovered, unpublicized vein in the remote regions near the current border with Canada, but also thousands of ounces of pure, high-grade copper. The value was staggering, whispered to be in the millions, a figure equivalent to perhaps $500 million in modern terms. Why the secrecy? Because the moment the Sulaks opened in 1855, the land value and the stock of his company, the St. Mary's Falls Ship Canal Company, would skyrocket. Stone was hoarding his fortune, moving it privately to major markets like New York and Boston before the boom. The ships would carry the iron openly, but the actual life-changing wealth, the phantom cargo, was sealed in the deep, reinforced holds, often beneath the heavy, mundane iron ore. By 1854, the Sulaks were nearing completion, and Stone's fleet, sometimes known as the Iron Line, was making its final, vital runs across Lake Superior. The ships were sailing close to the dangerous northern shores, utilizing a slightly shorter route to avoid the ice and the prying eyes of rivals. The fleet was ready for its final great push, carrying the future of American industry and Stone's personal massive fortune, when the disaster struck. Part 3. The Lake's Indifference and the Vanishing. Lake Superior is not just a lake, it is a freshwater inland sea, famous for its sudden, violent storms, its icy, 40-degree water year-round, and its crushing indifference to human enterprise. The old local adage was clear: Superior never gives up her dead. In the late autumn of 1854, a series of cyclonic storms ripped across the Great Lakes. These were not mere squalls, they were meteorological nightmares, capable of whipping the vast, deep waters into waves the height of a 3-story building. The exact details are shrouded in the fog of disaster and missing logs, but historical records point to a cluster of catastrophic events in the weeks leading up to the opening of the Sulaks. Stone's fleet, pushing its luck and its revolutionary designs in the face of nature's fury, began to vanish. One by one, ships disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the waves and the immense depth of the lake. The ironclad Adler, one of Stone's largest schooners, was reported lost near the Keweenaw Peninsula, taking with it a full load of ore and a considerable amount of private, high-value copper ingots. The sleek new steamship Plato, rumored to be carrying Stone's payroll and an emergency stash of gold bullion, was seen fighting the waves near the Pictured Rocks area before vanishing entirely. No wreck, no debris, no bodies, just silence. Most mysteriously, a schooner named the North Star, a vessel Stone was allegedly using almost exclusively for the transport of his secret wealth, simply ceased all contact. It was believed to be carrying the largest single consignment of the secret gold and silver. The total losses were staggering, far beyond typical maritime disasters. The disappearance of 5 major vessels, the heart of Stone's cutting-edge iron line, sent shockwaves through the nascent northern shipping industry. But the true deep secret of the loss was not the iron, it was the phantom cargo. Alfred P. Stone, who was already under enormous pressure from financing and construction delays, saw his private reserves, the secret gold that was meant to be his cushion, disappear into the black depths of Lake Superior. Part 4. The Cover-Up and the American Boom. When the Sioux Locks officially opened in 1855, it was a national triumph. The cost of shipping iron plummeted overnight. The floodgates of industry opened, and the Great Lakes became the economic engine of the country. The immense mineral wealth of the Upper Peninsula began flowing east, fueling the expansion of the railroads, the industrialization of the Civil War, and the post-war American boom. Alfred P. Stone achieved his national vision, but he lost his personal fortune. Facing ruin and the catastrophic loss of his ships, Stone and his surviving partners made a cold, calculated decision. The disappearance of the secret cargo could never be publicized. Financial ruin. Admitting the loss of millions in gold and silver bullion would instantly collapse the remaining financing for the canal company and sink his already precarious reputation. Safety risk. Publicizing a massive gold loss in the remote wilderness would invite an influx of desperate gold hunters and criminals, jeopardizing the entire, delicate operation of the new canal. Political survival. Many prominent U.S. political figures had invested in Stone's land deals based on the promise of that secret wealth. The loss would be politically explosive. The official narrative became that the lost ships were carrying only iron ore and general supplies. A costly disaster, but one that the rapidly booming industry could absorb. The true vast fortune, the phantom cargo of gold, silver, and high-grade copper, was excised from the records, becoming a ghost. Stone survived professionally, and his Sioux Locks became a permanent, foundational piece of American infrastructure, carrying more tonnage annually than the Suez and Panama Canals. But Alfred P. Stone died years later, a wealthy but haunted man, rumored to have spent his final days sketching maps of Lake Superior's darkest, deepest trenches. Part 5. The Legacy of the Ghost Fleet, the Enduring Mystery. For over 150 years, the story of the Ghost Fleet remained buried beneath the staggering success of the Great Lakes shipping industry. The official records note the loss of the ships, but the specific, high-value content vanished into folklore and the private records of old Cleveland and Detroit families. Modern wreck hunters armed with sophisticated sonar and deep-sea submersibles have scoured the legendary shipwrecked coast of Lake Superior. The lake is a graveyard for thousands of vessels, a testament to its ruthlessness. Many wrecks have been found, but the specific vessels of the Stone Fleet, the Adler, the Plato, and most importantly, the North Star, remain elusive. The Great Lakes offer unique challenges. Immense depth. Lake Superior is the deepest of the lakes with an average depth of 483 feet and parts plunging to over 1,300 feet, making deep-sea salvage immensely challenging. Cold preservation. The near-freezing, low-oxygen water preserves wrecks almost perfectly, but also makes them nearly impossible to find in the vast, cold expanse. Turbidity and sediment. The unique currents and sediment of the lake bottom can quickly and completely bury a wreck, turning a colossal wooden or iron hull into a ghost under a blanket of silt. The legend persists. Somewhere beneath the churning, freezing waves of Lake Superior rests a small, forgotten fleet of early industrial ships. In their perfectly preserved holds, beneath tons of black iron ore, lies a literal king's ransom of gold, silver, and copper bullion, a secret hoard that was meant to fund a tycoon's empire, but instead became one of the most astonishing and valuable vanished treasures in American history. The Ghost Fleet of the Great Lakes is a reminder that the most powerful forces that shaped the modern United States, industrialization, ruthless ambition, and the transport of massive wealth, were often built upon equally massive, silent disasters. Today, millions of tons of cargo pass through the Soo locks every year, fulfilling Alfred P. Stone's vision. Yet the price of that progress, the phantom cargo and the ships that carried the secret, still lies hidden, awaiting discovery, at the bottom of the lake that swallowed an American dream. Imagine a city built of wood and ambition, reduced to a smoking wasteland in a single night. Now imagine that amid the ashes and ruin, the greatest prize was not a vault of money or a cache of jewels, but a small, unassuming library that held the collective history and soul of a young, powerful nation. What if that library, containing books so rare they were literally priceless, vanished without a trace, and the man tasked with saving them disappeared into a dark fog of rumor and speculation? This is the true epic story of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, not as a simple urban disaster, but as a colossal, world-changing mystery involving a frantic rescue, an ambitious tycoon, an obsessive librarian, and the disappearance of what was perhaps the single most valuable collection of early American and European history ever assembled in the West, a collection that remains the holy grail for book hunters and historians today. Part 1. The City of Destiny and the Private Treasure. By 1871, Chicago was the quintessential American boomtown. In just a few decades, it had exploded from a muddy frontier trading post to the nation's railway and commercial hub. It was brash, wealthy, and built for speed, literally built on top of its own sewage, hastily constructed